Hi, I'm Kristen and this is Scrap Fabric Love, and today I'm wrapping up the Scrappy Strips quilt along. So this is a quilt along I've been doing for the last I think 3 or 4 videos on the channel, and a bunch of you have been making this quilt with me. There's actually 2 versions. There's like a bigger block traditionally pieced version and a smaller block foundation paper pieced version, but it was all about using up leftover scraps that were already in your sewing room. And I've had a lot of fun making mine. I made both versions because that's what I'm like. And I did show the finish of one, the foundation paper piece version, last week in my video all about the join and flip quilt as you go method. So if you missed that, you can go back and check it out, but I'll show you the quilt again today. Because today what I'm going to do is talk you through finishing up and constructing my traditionally pieced version. And then I'm going to talk about the quilting choices I made for both versions of the quilt. Not because those are the only ways you can quilt this quilt, but just to like give you some ideas to spark your own imagination for how you might want to quilt yours. And then lastly, the best bit, I'm going to show you some photos from members of Scrap Club who have been making this quilt with me. So if you don't know what Scrap Club is, this is my no judgment online quilting community. It's over on Patreon. We have monthly Zooms with show and tell and quilty chat, and there's some great fun quilters in this group, and some of them have allowed me to share their photos of progress towards finishing the Scrappy Strips quilt along. So stay tuned for that at the end, because that's going to be the absolute best bit. If you've not been following the Scrappy Strips quilt along, it's made up of 2 blocks, basically a log cabin block and a Bargello block, and you can get the instructions for that by looking back at the previous videos. But at this point here, what I'm doing is laying out all my blocks and just kind of doing that shuffle around of where do I want which block to go, because this was made in a very scrappy way. I didn't kind of plan where every patch was going to be in the quilt. So there was a little bit of, there's too much pink over there or too much blue over there. I think we've all done that kind of thing when we're laying out a quilt. But sometimes this is the fun bit. This version of the quilt is the bigger one, and I wasn't planning on adding a border, but in sort of sitting and staring at it like this, I changed my mind. So I was not actually planning on doing a border for this quilt. It's not in the design, but I've now decided I'm going to put a little one on, just because I do have some leftover background strips. And I also quite like to give myself a little bit of extra, fudge room around the edge of my quilt when I put it on the long arm. In case I stretch something the wrong way or something, I've got something to trim and I don't lose any of my actual design. Anyway, that's what I do. So anyhow, I'm not cutting long strips for the border though, because I had some 2.5-inch strips left over. So here's what I've done. I have cut 20 12.5 by 2.5-inch strips. So it's going to be like a 2.5-inch border, or I guess with the seam allowance, that's 2.25, whatever. Anyway, and so the 20 strips are going to go, let me see if you can see this on the camera. Let me move you back a bit. Right, I'm going to show you on this bottom half here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just add an extra strip so on the bottom of the strips on the bottom, kind of like this. Can you see that? But it's going to be different, so it's still scrappy like the rest of the background, right? Like here, okay, so it's going to be like that. And then because on the corner, so if say I added this one here, right? I've got to press these, of course. Then this one on the corner needs to be longer, right? So I've got some 14.5-inch ones, 4 of them for each corner. So each corner is going to need to have a slightly longer one on one side. Okay, so I'm going to put that there, right? So that's how I'm going to do it. So I've kind of set my layout, and I'm going to, for the outside blocks, so not the ones in the middle, but the outside blocks, I'm going to add these strips to make this scrappy border. So that's totally optional, but if you have leftover strips and you fancy a border, it's an option. But I would, if you're going to add it like this, I would add it to the blocks before you join the blocks rather than making this into one long strip, because then we need to match more points, whereas if we sew it together here, we're just basically matching the blocks. Do you know what I mean? So anyway, hope that makes sense. I'm going to go and add those, and then I'll come back and show you what I'm doing next. If you're in Scrap Club, your handout this week is going to have all of the measurements to do this scrappy border. So I just kind of went along adding those scrappy strips to the outside of my blocks to make my border. And then I started grouping the blocks together to start piecing my rows. Okay, so I've been just piecing bits and pieces together as I go. So I've got a couple rows that are already joined, but I just wanted to show a few bits of the blocks to you, especially if you are a beginner, just for the few places to look out for that we want to ideally, but don't stress, make the seams nest or meet, things like that. So let me just show you where we are. The light today is a bit strange because it's kind of, sun's coming in certain places. Anyway, so hopefully you can see this. So the only places on the Bargello blocks, and I've already joined these, so it's not a great illustration here, but are where one block meets another. You're going to have two bars or two units that are exactly the same beside each other. So it's really just here and here where those bars meet that we're trying our best to make them join up, whether that's nesting the seams or ironing your seams open, whichever way you like to do it. If it doesn't go perfectly, don't worry, because the whole thing's, you know, going like this, okay? But that's the one spot there. On the log cabin ones, let me just grab one. So I've already joined two here. And so I've maybe not done this one perfectly, so it's a good example, but the only place really is here where the white, or well, in my case, white, the background fabric meets each other, because where the two hero fabrics meet in the middle, let me just show you there, there's really nothing to match. So the only thing is down here. So I've not quite done it there, but anyway, you see the idea. And again, I'm not going to unpick it when it's just a little smidgen off. I don't think it affects the look. Anyway, that's the one place. And then when I go to join this one to this one, let me just pull this one over here. There's three now. So then I'm trying to line up here, here, and then just in the middle. Okay. And so all I would do is put that right sides together. I would usually start probably in the middle, and if the seam's not going the way I need it to nest, I'll just push it over and we can re-iron it. And I would put a little clip just there, and then find where I want it to nest up here and see which seam wants to move where, and clip. And similarly down here. And then the other place that because you know I'm not a super pinner, so I guess I'm a clipper. But the other place that I might clip, which I think I was doing on the Bargello blocks as well, is just at the very end. So here's my block. It's all, or my, well, a few of my blocks that I'm joining, right? So I'm going down here. So I would start here, right? So at the top, so I can obviously make sure these two are matched at the top. But what I often do is also have a pin at the bottom, just to make sure that whatever else is moving when I'm going along, it's going to match up at the end as well. So if you're having, I mean, that's not necessary, but if you're struggling with things stretching or pulling or not lining up, that's usually a good way to make sure you end up in the right place. So, okay. Anyway, I'm sure many of you do not need those tips, and you can just get on with putting this together yourself. I would kind of go at this however you like. So I decided to piece so I've got these two top rows pieced, these two bottom rows pieced, and then I'm piecing the middle into kind of these 4-patch sections before I join it into a row, because the main thing that I really want to line up is the stuff in the middle of the block, and then I will go ahead and join them. So I'm sure there's more efficient ways to do it, but anyway, I'm just going to finish piecing my quilt top, and then we're going to talk quilting options. I also needed to piece backing for my quilt. I decided I wanted to go with fleece. I had a thrifted fleece blanket that I wanted to use in a teal color. It wasn't quite big enough, but I also had some fleece scraps from other quilts I've made where I've done fleece backing, and there's been like a strip left over when you trim it, you know. So I gathered those together to try and just make my backing big enough. All right, so here's the finished quilt top, and I've pieced this blanket together with my leftover bits of fleece. I'm just going to do a final check to see it's the right size. And it is tight, but I think it's going to work. That's what I think. I hope. I never actually measure this stuff. I just kind of have a check, see. Right, okay, so I've held it up on this side, and I've got that much extra, so that's okay. Because it'll be like divided, oh, it'll be in the middle, so it'll be divided between here and here. And then I gotta check the length. Yeah, and that's fine. So I can see that the end is longer than I need, so should be all right. I'm going to load it up with the teal side at the top so that if I have a longer length that I need, I'm cutting off more of this stuff at the bottom rather than the teal, which I would have used if I had a blanket the size of that for the whole thing. But anyway, okay, cool. So now, ridiculously, I have this quilt that I started on the long arm that I was gonna it's not just this thing in the middle. I was gonna do some other stuff around it. I will probably have it on the channel in future, but I got distracted by the quilt along. So basically I need to take this off the frame so that I can quilt the quilt I want to quilt now. And then I'll just have to load it back on again at a future time when I'm ready to finish it. So yeah, I'll do that. So let me show you what I'm using for batting. So because I've got the kind of thick fleece for my backing, I've decided to try something different for the batting this time. I don't know if any of you have seen, but I had a previous video about alternative materials you can use for batting as opposed to just always buying new store-bought batting. And so I had a few suggestions in that video. I'll link it in the description. But in the comments from that video, somebody else mentioned curtain lining, like the stuff that goes on the inside of the curtain, not the pretty fabric, the other bit. And then I saw this, I can't remember how many meters it was, but it was quite a bit of it. It's kind of onto the floor here in my local charity shop. So it obviously wasn't wide enough. I did piece it and it's fairly thin. It feels like cotton to me just from touching it, but I'm not sure. But it's soft, but it's relatively thin. So it's not, it's definitely not a lofty batting. But I wanted to add it anyway. You might be saying, well, you've got this big thick fleece backing. Why do you need batting at all? And you don't necessarily. There's, I've made another video about using fleece with and without batting and what that looks like. But this time I am using it because the quilt top, which I need to probably iron again because there it is on the floor, but the background is white. Right? I know there's the black and there's the colors, but there's white. And then my backing is like this teal mostly, and then a bit of gray. So it's kind of darker. So I don't want to see that through the front. So I was thinking if I use this, that might help keep the white background looking white. So we'll see if it works. Often when I quilt on my long arm, I go for some sort of tried and tested quilting method that I've used a bunch of times and I can just do quickly, like straight lines or wavy lines. But for this quilt, this is one of those times when I just felt like having a play, having a bit of a practice, stretching myself a bit. So this is me trying some ruler work. So I'm trying to use the rulers to improve my stitch in the ditch. It's historically not one of my top skills, but if I don't do it, I'll never get any better. So that's what I basically decided to do, was stitch in the ditch around basically all of the patches in this quilt. And then in the background, but not in the hero or accent fabric. So in the background, my white fabric, I tried like a different freehand or ruler work design in each patch. So I don't have Pro Stitch or any other kind of like computer software on my long arm. So it's all freehand, but I didn't want to commit myself to trying, some sort of quilting design, and you get partway through and you're like, I really don't like this. And then you've got the whole rest of the quilt to fill. So I decided I would do something different in each section. So if there's a section that I'm not in love with, that's fine. I'll just move on and do another one. And that's pretty much what happens. I've tried this a few times with different quilts. And what ends up happening is there'll be little areas where I'm like, that is awful. And then other areas where I'm like, I really, really like that, in terms of the quilting design I tried. But when you take the whole quilt off the frame in the end, all you see is this lovely mix of texture, and you don't focus on the areas where maybe the thing you tried didn't work out so well. Don't get me wrong, it did take way longer than if I had picked something like a stipple or just some wavy lines all over the quilt. And I definitely love doing those pretty often. But I do recommend this if you're ever in the mood to just kind of push yourself and have a play and see what you can do. So if you think about it, every little patch is just another opportunity to try something else. And if it goes wrong, it's really only a tiny area of the quilt and you don't need to stress about it. And you don't need a long arm to try this either. So you could be doing this with free motion quilting on a domestic. You could be doing with walking foot quilting designs. There's so many different things you can do with straight lines and walking feet. So yeah, I recommend it. It's fun. And I think it is probably the only way I learn and get better at my quilting is just by trying and letting myself make mistakes. So there's definitely areas of this quilt that I like way better than others. But as I said, overall, all you see is just that lovely texture, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I was also kind of experimenting with that whole idea about how you focus on the area that doesn't get quilted rather than the one that does. So that's why I put all of the texture and all of the quilting in the background fabric and none of it in the hero and the accent fabric. But there's definitely different choices you could make. This is not at all the only way you could quilt this quilt. But as I said, I'm happy with how it turned out, and I'm glad I took the time to experiment. And there's probably some of these quilting designs that I did in some of these little patches I could see myself using on a larger scale on some other quilts in the future. And here is a view of the quilt from the back. Every time I use fleece for a backing, I always think the quilting looks so much better on the back of the quilt than the front. I guess it's just the poof of it just shows that definition. So I think you can probably get an even better idea of how I quilted this quilt by looking at the back. So you can see the outline of the patches in the center of those log cabin blocks and the Bargello blocks. So for the Bargello rows, rather than do a different quilting design in each patch of those units, I went for straight line quilting above and below the accented Bargello patches. So I hope that makes sense. And then it was more around the log cabin and the border where I kind of switched it up with the quilting designs. As I mentioned at the top of the video, there's two versions of this quilt. So I also made one with smaller blocks using foundation paper piecing, and this is it here, and I had denim in this quilt. I showed this coming together in more detail in last week's video because it was put together using my favorite quilt as you go technique, so it was entirely done on the domestic. And I quilted kind of the log cabin blocks in sections and the Bargello blocks in rows before I put the whole thing together. And it's much simpler quilting design. I just sort of stitched either side of the ditch to kind of mimic the seam lines in denim jeans, I guess. And I really like this for this kind of quilt because even if your lines aren't totally straight, it just kind of gives you that definition, and I think it's pretty forgiving. So that's why I went with that one for this version. But enough about my quilts. Let's have a look at what other folk in Scrap Club have been doing with this pattern. So these photos all came from the fabulous members of my Scrap Club over on Patreon. We've been going for just about a month. And there's already so many super cool quilters doing their own interpretation of this quilt along and obviously their own projects as well. And it's been super fun to see how people have mixed and matched some of the blocks in this quilt. Some of them are making just Bargello block quilts. Some have just put their own twist on the log cabin blocks. It's just been super fun and kind of inspiring to see what everybody is doing. If you're in Scrap Club and you wanted to share but you don't see your photo here, it's not because I didn't like it, it's because I didn't see the comment that said it was okay to share. So next time we'll get yours up there. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I really had fun making this quilt. Next week, I'll be bringing you along with me to the Scottish Quilting Show in Glasgow. So I'm going there on the weekend and I'll have the video up about all of the quilts there and all of the things there were to see next Tuesday. If you're going to be at the quilt show, do let me know. I'd love to meet up with you. And if this was your first visit to my channel, thanks so much for watching. I generally do scrap quilts. I don't follow a lot of quilting rules. I like to experiment. That's pretty much what it is. If that sounds like your kind of thing, you might want to check out Scrap Club. As I said, this is my like no quilt rules community where it's no judgment, totally beginner friendly, and there's lots of cool folk already inside sharing and supporting each other, and I'd love to see you there. I'll put a link in the description so you can get all the details. Anyway, I hope to see you next week, and thanks so much for spending time with me. Bye.